There is a millennial individual sitting at a stoplight on an ordinary Thursday, and a song comes on the radio. And for no reason they can immediately name their chest tightens. It happens fast, the way these things usually do. Gone almost before it is fully registered. The song has nothing to do with anything in particular. It is not connected to a person, an event, a memory that explains the reaction. It simply happens to be the kind of song they used to imagine writing. Back when writing songs was something they still imagined doing, the light turns green. They drive on. The feeling passes, mostly filed away in the place where these feelings get filed, which is to say nowhere in particular, never examined, never named. This happens more often than the millennial individual would admit if asked directly. A gallery walked past. A friend's small business succeeding. A documentary about someone who did the thing, wrote the book, started the label, opened the studio, and a feeling arrives that does not have a clean name. Because it is not envy exactly, and it is not regret exactly, and it is certainly not something the millennial individual would describe as grief, because grief is supposed to be for things that existed and were lost. This was never a thing. It was an idea. You cannot grieve an idea, except, increasingly, the research on grief disagrees with that assumption. And so it turns out, does the chest tightening at a stoplight for no reason anyone bothered to investigate? There is a clinical term for the specific category of loss the millennial individual is carrying. It is called disenfranchised grief, a term introduced by the grief researcher Kenneth Doka in the late 1980s, describing loss that is not socially recognized, validated, or given space to be mourned. The classic examples are things like a relationship that was never publicly acknowledged, or grief over a miscarriage that happened early enough that few people knew about the pregnancy at all. The defining feature is not the magnitude of the loss. It is the absence of social permission to treat it as a loss in the first place. Nobody sends a card. There is no ritual, no script for processing something that, by the culture's own rules, was never allowed to count as real to begin with. The career the millennial individual never had fits this category with unsettling precision. There was no announcement that it ended because it never began. If the millennial individual brought it up at a dinner party, I sometimes think about how I never tried to be a musician. The most likely response, delivered kindly, would be something like, it's not too late, or you can still do it as a hobby, both of which function as a refusal to let the loss be a loss. The conversation gets redirected towards solutions before the grief has been allowed to exist. And so the millennial individual learned to stop bringing it up. The feeling did not go anywhere. It just stopped having anywhere to go. To understand why so many millennial individuals are carrying this particular unmourned loss, it helps to look at the timing of their early adulthood. The millennial individual graduated, broadly speaking, somewhere between 2005 and 2015, meaning a significant portion either entered the workforce directly into the 2008 financial crisis or spent their early career years in its long aftermath. Entry-level positions evaporated. Internships, frequently unpaid, became the de facto entry point. Student debt arrived regardless of whether a job market existed on the other end of the degree. In an environment like that, what do you want to do with your life quietly transformed into what will keep you housed? The millennial individual who had once imagined writing, performing, building something creative and uncertain looked at the actual landscape and made what was, by any reasonable measure, the responsible decision. They took the stable job first. This was not weakness. It was an accurate read of a genuinely hostile economic environment made by people who had watched their slightly older peers graduate directly into unemployment. The caution was earned, but the caution also had a cost. And the cost is the thing nobody scheduled time to grieve. There is a concept from economics that maps onto this experience with uncomfortable accuracy. Opportunity cost. The idea that every choice forecloses the alternatives not chosen. Economists use the term clinically, but opportunity cost, lived rather than calculated, carries an emotional weight the spreadsheet version does not capture. Every year spent building the stable career was also simultaneously a year not spent building the uncertain one. What makes this loss difficult to grieve cleanly is that it has no fixed shape. The millennial individual is not mourning a specific failed attempt. There is no manuscript that got rejected, no audition that went badly. There is only the absence of the attempt itself, which means the loss is, in a sense, unfalsifiable. The imagined life never had to survive contact with reality, so it never had the chance to disappoint in any ordinary way. It remains permanently undefeated, a perfect, untested possibility, frozen at the moment it was set aside. Failure has texture, specific reasons, lessons, a story that can eventually be integrated and moved past. An attempt that never happened offers no texture to work with. It just sits there, refusing to become anything the millennial individual can fully process. This grief takes a particular shape in adulthood, one the millennial individual experiencing it rarely recognizes for what it is. It shows up as the song at the stoplight. It shows up watching a documentary about an artist who built a career from nothing, producing something not quite admiration and not quite envy, but adjacent to both. It shows up at a friend's gallery opening, smiling and saying congratulations and meaning it, while something underneath sits very still, taking up space that was never given permission to exist out loud. It shows up, most specifically in a fierce insistence that one's own children try the thing. Take the lesson, audition for the part, regardless of whether it leads anywhere practical, because some part of the parent is determined this child will not arrive at 35, wondering what would have happened. This is not dysfunction. It is grief doing what grief does when it has nowhere sanctioned to go. It finds side doors, leaking into unrelated moments, organizing itself around other people's lives, because it was never permitted to organize itself around the millennial individual's own. Grief that is denied social acknowledgement does not disappear. It tends to become more complicated, precisely because it cannot move through the ordinary stages acknowledged grief moves through the social validation, the shared mourning. Disenfranchised grief instead gets stored rather than processed. It surfaces unpredictably, attaching itself to substitute objects, the documentary, the gallery opening, the radio song, because it never had a clean, named place to be felt directly. The first step, according to most of the clinical literature, is disarmingly simple and surprisingly difficult, naming it as grief in the first place, not reframing it as something to be solved, not redirecting it toward it's not too late, which short-circuits the grieving process before it has had room to happen. Just naming it. I think I'm still mourning a version of my life I never lived. That sentence does something 10 years of vague chest tightening at stoplights has not managed to do. It gives the feeling a shape. There is a meaningful distinction worth drawing here. Grieving the unlived creative life is not the same project as resurrecting it. Some millennial individuals, once they name the grief honestly, do go on to pick the instrument back up, take the class, write the first chapter, and that is a genuinely good outcome when it happens. But it is not the required outcome, and treating it as required puts the same pressure on the grief that it's not too late puts on it. The actual work is acknowledging that a real loss occurred, not a failure, not a character flaw, but an authentic loss, chosen against under specific and largely reasonable economic pressure, and giving it the basic dignity any other loss receives. The permission to feel sad about it without immediately being told to fix it, monetize it, or revive it as a side hustle. The millennial individual sitting at that stoplight, chest tightening at a song that connects to nothing they can name, is not malfunctioning. They are responding accurately to a real and significant loss that the culture around them has never once given them. Permission to call by its actual name. The career was never lived. That is true, but the wanting was real and the choosing against it, under circumstances that demanded caution from an entire generation entering adulthood into economic wreckage, was also real, and the quiet cost of that choice has been accumulating, unnamed and unmourned, for the better part of 2 decades. It does not need to be fixed. It needs first, simply to be allowed to exist. The light turns green. The millennial individual drives on, the same as always, but perhaps having finally let the feeling have its name, carrying it just slightly differently than before. This grief tends to intensify rather than fade as the millennial individual moves further into their 30s, and there is a reason for that. Rooted in how the mind tracks time and possibility rather than in anything going wrong, developmental psychologists describe something called the possible selves framework. The different versions of who a person might become that coexist in the imagination throughout early adulthood. In one's 20s, these remain relatively open. The musician and the project manager both still feel reachable because time remains, theoretically, to pivot toward either one. Something shifts in the mid to late 30s. The window in which a possible self could still plausibly become real begins to narrow, and that shift produces an urgency the grief did not carry a decade earlier. The stoplight moment hits harder at 36 than at 26, because narrowing windows tend to surface exactly the kind of grief that wide open ones allow people to postpone indefinitely. It is worth being precise about what this is not suggesting. This is not an argument that the millennial individual made the wrong choice. The economic conditions following 2008 made caution a rational, often necessary response to a genuinely brutal labor market. Romanticizing the unchosen path, treating it as the secretly correct option that conformity prevented, would be its own dishonesty. A tidier narrative that avoids the messier truth, something mattered. It was given up under real pressure, and giving it up cost something, independent of whether keeping it would have worked out. Nor is this an argument to abandon a stable career to chase the unlived one, as though grief can only be honored through dramatic correction. Some people, after sitting honestly with this loss, do make exactly that change. But the grief work does not require that outcome. A person can fully acknowledge a real loss, give it its proper weight, and continue living the life they actually built. And that is not a failure to act on the grief. That is what what grieving an unlived possibility rather than reviving it looks like when done honestly. The two outcomes are not in competition with each other, and neither one is the correct answer that the other one failed to reach. What tends to help is less about action and more about ritual, borrowing, in small private ways, from the structures that acknowledged grief is permitted to use freely. Writing a letter to the unlived version of the self, never meant to be sent. Saying the loss out loud once to one trusted person using the actual word grief, and asking that person simply to witness it rather than offer solutions. Marking, even privately, the approximate moment the choice was made, not to relitigate it, but to give a vague lifelong ache something with edges, something that can finally be set down because it has been picked up properly and acknowledged as real. None of this resolves the loss in a single sitting, but disenfranchised grief tends to soften, gradually and unevenly. Once it stops being denied the basic legitimacy any other loss receives without question. The permission, as it turns out, was always the only thing actually missing. Thanks for watching. If this felt familiar, leave a comment about the thing you set aside. You don't have to do anything about it. You're just allowed to say it was real.